gave everybody, I thought, who was here, unless you came in after I handed them, a paper regarding Exodus chapters 21 to 23. Is anybody who didn't get one? Turn to Exodus 20, actually 19, because that leads up to the Ten Commandments. But Exodus chapter 20 has the Ten Commandments, and God gave those to Moses on top of the mountain, and there was on Mount Sinai. And there was a real scary situation going on for the people when this happened. The mountain started shaking, and I'm sure they probably thought it was like an earthquake, and all this smoke billowed from the top of it. And God gave them strict warnings not to come up on the mountain except for Moses, and then anybody else that he designated. He does designate Moses' brother to come up at one point. To remind you about this particular prelude to Moses going up to the mountain, let's look at chapter 19 of Exodus, if you want to turn to your Bibles, and look at starting with verse number 14 of chapter 19 of Exodus. After Moses had gone down the mountain to the people, he consecrated them, and they washed their clothes. Then he said to the people, "Prepare yourselves for the third day. Abstain from sexual relations." On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning, with a thick cloud over the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. As the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder, Moses spoke, and the voice of God answered him. The Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. So Moses went up, and the Lord said to him, "Go down and warn the people, so they do not force their way through to see the Lord, and many of them perish. Even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them." Moses said to the Lord, "The people cannot come up Mount Sinai, because you yourself warned us. Put limits around the mountain and set it apart as holy." Holiness is something that is set apart for God. Now, normally we think of holiness as living a good life, a godly life, a separate life. And that's exactly what it is. But there were things in the Bible that we're going to read in Exodus that were also holy. Things were set apart as being holy. They could not be duplicated. There was incense that God made for the worship service. He gave the formula for it. And it was holy. It was specially for the use in the tabernacle for worship later in the temple when it was built. And it could not be used in a home or for any common use, because it was set apart for that particular purpose. The people were warned not to even touch the mountain, or they would die. We didn't read about that because that was previous to this. Even animals that would come up and touch the mountain would die. So, the warning was very stern. Moses said to the Lord, "The people cannot come up Mount Sinai because you yourself warned us. Put limits around the mountain and set it apart as holy." The Lord replied, "Go down and bring Aaron up with you." Aaron, of course, is Moses' brother and would be the high priest. When we get towards the end of Exodus, which we should be doing next week, we see that there were some very much details about Aaron being the high priest, his sons who also were priests, and their service in the tabernacle. A lot of details about what he had to wear and how he had to get himself ready to make sacrifices and all the things that they had to do. So he said, "Go down and bring Aaron up with you, but the priests and the people must not force their way through to come up to the Lord, or he will break out against them." So Moses went down to the people and told them. Now in Acts chapter 20, we're going to look at the Ten Commandments. Now you'll notice that the Ten Commandments, some of them are very brief in their statements, and others are quite lengthy. Sometimes we forget about that. The first four of the Ten Commandments relate to our relationship with God. The last six of the Ten Commandments relate to our relationship to one another. So we'll look at the first four, and they had to do with primarily with God alone being worshipped and no idols. This was a great problem for the children of Israel. They lived for 430 years in a nation that worshiped so many different idols. And remember, the 10 plagues themselves represented some of those idols that they worshipped. They worshiped snakes and cats and the Nile, and of course the Nile turned red. They worshiped Pharaoh. They worshiped all these things. And so the children of Israel, even though they knew they were Jews, even though they knew of Jehovah God, still they were influenced by all of these idols. So God had stern instructions about them not getting into idol worship. The most punishment that they ever received all through the years, whether it was in the wilderness or whether it was after they settled in the promised land, was their problem with idol worship. And of course the problem with idol worship wasn't only that you did not worship God and you worshiped something else besides God, but the awful atrocities that were associated with idol worship. For example, the god Moloch required the killing of little children. They were to be burned alive as they worshipped Moloch. And God, of course, despised that. And also many of the idol worship, the worship itself was very sensual. It wasn't spiritual. It wasn't holy like we think of separate living. But it was indulging in sexual immorality. Nearly all of the idols had their own places of worship, and they had statues of the idol, but they also had prostitutes. They had male prostitutes and female prostitutes. And part of the worship was having sexual immorality with these prostitutes. The prostitutes would be paid, and then that money would be dedicated to the goddess or the god. And of course, a fertility god, such as Moloch was, you could see where they would practice immoral sexuality with them, because them being a fertility god, both the female counterpart, Shira was the female counterpart. And interestingly enough, even in the 70s, there was a superhero on the cartoon channel called She-Ra. And here we have Moloch's counterpart named Shira. And of course, she was very immoral. Now, we're sure that the children would not associate that superhero with that, but I think it's interesting how after all these thousands of years, some of these things still crop up. And so one of the things, the many things about idol worship was not just that you bowed down before some piece of wood that couldn't speak, but all that was associated with it, the wickedness that was associated with it as well. So this is what God says in the first four of the Ten Commandments. If you want to look at chapter 20, starting with verse 1. And God spoke all these words, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. Then he starts in by giving the actual command. You shall have no other gods before me. And notice the second command, the second commandment, is more lengthy, and it is detailed accounts of what he already said in the first commandment. The second commandment is, you shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven, above, or on earth, beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. Now, most of you may not be aware how long the second commandment was, but it still goes on. Punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. So the second commandment was quite lengthy. The third commandment has to do with God's name and not taking his name in vain, which is a common practice in our culture. People use God's name to curse others, or to even curse God himself if they hate God or if they're angry at him. It can also be done by Christian people who use God's name as sort of a byword. Maybe something, they may drop a dish on the floor and break it. They may run through a stop sign and hit somebody, and they'll say, oh, God, calling upon God. Now, if we call upon God, that's something different. That's not taking his name in vain. But, even in the texting when you have the Facebook and all that stuff, they have letters for oh my God, and that's vain. That's not anything calling on God. So this is what he says in the third one. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. The fourth commandment has to do with the Sabbath, and it's a long commandment as well. We just usually break it down to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. But notice how long it is. Remember the Sabbath day, which is the sixth day of the week, because Sunday is the seventh day. Sunday is the Lord's day, and the Sabbath would be their Saturday. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them. But he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Our Lord Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. It was for man to rest. It was so his servants can rest, and even his animals could rest. So we're told to remember the Sabbath day. Now, does this apply to New Testament Christians who live under a new covenant? Some say it does. So there are religious groups who are called Christian, but who deny the importance of the Lord's Day as we know it, which is the day that Jesus came back from the dead, which is Sunday, the day when the church started on the day of Pentecost, the day that we're told to partake of the Lord's Supper in Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, the day that we're told in 1 Corinthians to make a collection for the church on the first day of the week. So that's why we honor that as the Lord's Day. The Sabbath day was for God's Jewish Israelite people. That's who it was for. Many of these laws that we're going to look at, some of the laws we still use in our culture today, and were even carried over in the New Testament. But some of the laws had to do with just the nation of Israel and their worship. But when our Lord came, and all the people of the world was included in that covenant, all Gentiles, everybody, Jews too, them first, and then Gentiles, people weren't required to do the same commandments as they did in the Old Testament. And so we want to make sure that we do that distinction. Now, many of these rules now that we're going to see next in the Ten Commandments that deal with our relationship to one another are still in the books today. Not only in the Lord's book, in the New Testament and the Old, but is in the books of almost every nation around the world. And let's look at those. The next one has to do with honoring your father and your mother. And we're going to see in just a moment the punishment if you don't. Honor your father and your mother so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. So that is called the first commandment with promise. And that is, if you do that, God is going to give you a good long life. Then the next commandment, very short to the point. Almost every society has this commandment. You shall not murder. Then the next commandment, many societies, and the Jewish society practice this one too, you shall not commit adultery. And you'll remember that in the Jewish religion, if you practice this, both the man and the woman could be stoned for committing adultery. But in the country we live in now, adultery is not even thought of as a crime. And so we just kind of roughshod over it and think God doesn't care. But God still has strong warnings against fornication in the New Testament, which includes adultery, and it includes homosexuality. It includes bestiality, any type of perverse form of sexualism. He has laws against it. Then he says, you shall not steal. Most every culture has laws against that. Our laws on that are weakening, just like many of the laws we have in our country today. Now there's laws in the books in some states that you can steal as much as $750 from a store and not even be held accountable for it. And it's pitiful. No wonder businesses don't want to go out of business now. Then you shall not give a false testimony against your neighbor. And the courts, of course, punish you for false testimony. And then stealing. Again, but this time not just things. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. So these are the laws that God handed down. And we're going to notice that God had some punishments to back them up. And some of the punishments are very stern and strong. Now, it's interesting. I never did know that there was even laws on the books in some communities, in some states, in some counties, against cohabitation of people who were unmarried. But it was told to me when I went to be the minister at Ford's Branch that the minister who started the church there, Brother Ford, and that would have been Bill Ford from Zebulun, that would have been his father, and there was a couple in the community of Ford's Branch that were living together without marriage, and he went to the courthouse in Pikeville and got a warrant for them so that they could not do that anymore. Now, it wouldn't even be thought of today. Even if there's a record on the book somewhere, it would just be ignored. But God was very strong about it. And you remember even in the time of Jesus, when the woman who was taken into adultery was brought before Jesus, they wanted to know from Jesus what he's going to do about it, because they said, remember, Moses said she's to be stoned. And of course she wasn't stoned. The Romans wouldn't allow it. Jesus even said, he that is among you without sin, you can cast the first stone. So they just threw their stones down. But they brought this woman in because this was God's original law. Now, they were not very fair about it, though. They caught her in the act of adultery, and that means that the man was with her. But they didn't bring the man, just brought the woman. And the law of God is that both the man and the woman would be stoned to death for doing that. So we notice in verse 18, when the people saw the thunder and lightning and heard the trumpet and saw the mountain in smoke, they trembled with fear. They stayed at a distance and said to Moses, speak to us yourself, and we will listen. They didn't even want to hear God's voice because they were afraid that they might die. They said, you speak to us, and we'll listen. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die. Moses said to the people, do not be afraid. God has come to test you so that the fear of God will be with you to keep you from sinning. The people remained at distance while Moses approached the thickness where God was. Now, we're going to look at your outline here, and instead of just reading through chapters 21, 22, and 23, I made some notes that we can go over it to bring to your attention some personal laws and social laws that were given to Moses about Israel. They had to have some laws, and these are the laws. Now, what do you think, what kind of a government do you think that the Israelites had? Did they have I'll throw some things out here, and you can tell me which one you think it is. Did they have a democracy? Did they have communism? Did they have socialism? Did they have a theocracy? What kind of a dictatorship? What kind of government do you think the Jewish people had? Theocracy. Theo meaning God. So theocracy, that's right. God was the ruler of the nation. He gave the laws, and it was up to the people. There are certain people designated to enforce the laws. Some of the laws were civil laws, and some of the laws were religious laws. We're not going to look at the religious laws tonight, particularly, except as they relate to both civil and religion. But we'll look at some of the religious laws as far as their worship, and you're going to notice it was really different than New Testament worship. Sacrificing of animals, the burning of incense, things that we do not practice today because, again, I said it was part of an old covenant Old Testament, or covenant that God had with those people that did not apply to New Testament people. We'll learn more about that later, because that was one of the problems in the early church. The Jewish people became Christians first. First 10 years of the church was Jewish people. But then Gentiles started coming in the church. Some, not all, some Jewish people said to the Gentiles, the non-Jews, if you're going to be a Christian, you've got to circumcise your children. If you're going to be a Christian, you've got to observe, and we have it here in the bottom of the list. We're not going to get to it tonight to explain it. There's 3 festivals yearly that they had to celebrate. The Festival of Unleavened Bread, which is a Passover, the Festival of Harvest, and the Festival of Ingathering. They were required. Well, the New Testament Jewish people were saying to the Gentiles, now you've got to observe these special holidays. And you've got to do some other things that we did, or you can't be a true Christian. Well, Paul came along, and Peter too, said, no, they don't have to do that. That was for another covenant. That was for another time. That was for another nation. And so we have to be able to distinguish that. And for example, Ed Bosman, everybody knows him. He's been a TV evangelist. Not everybody, but those of us in the Church of Christ. And a radio evangelist. And he preached here, and we had decisions here when he came. And he talked about when he was a teenager, he became a Christian, and the minister's name was O.L. Mancomer. I've heard O.L. Mancomer preach at the prayer clinic. That was his minister. Well, he started talking to different religious people, and he was talking to some people who are members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and they believed in Saturday worship, Sabbath worship on Saturday. And so that worried him, and he went to the home of O.L. Mancomer to find out more about it. And he went to the home, and when he got there were several people waiting in the foyer of his home to talk to him, a lady and a man, and then himself. And when he finally got to Ed Bosman, he wanted to know what he wanted. And O.L. was very abrupt kind of a person. You'd probably think he was hateful, but he wasn't really hateful, but he was abrupt. And Ed brought this up to him. He says, I heard that we're supposed to obey the Sabbath, and that's Saturday. And he told him that. And Mancomer said this to Ed Bosman. He said, are you a Jew? And Ed said, no. He said, then that's not for you. Forget it. You see, that was for the Jewish race. And a lot of not only that, there were a lot of things there that was for the Jewish race. It was not for us. Now, some of these moral laws, civil laws that are on the law books today are carried over, and even Jesus he said he didn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. And he carried and reinstated some of these laws, like in the Sermon on the Mount, for example, he did. Now, let's notice how strict God was about some of these issues. We're going to look, first of all, personal injuries and then some social laws. And notice these personal injuries where you get the death penalty. If you strike someone with a fatal blow. Now, they didn't have guns. We have guns in our culture. They want to take guns away. And, of course, I suppose some people should have their guns taken from them and should have strong laws against people that are criminals and people that are mentally ill. I'm not opposed to that. But I think it's interesting that a lot of people were killed just by striking them. And if they were, that would be a death sentence. And logically, if you killed somebody deliberately with a stone or with your hands or with a weapon, a sword or something, if you killed them deliberately, you would get the death sentence. The only exception to that is they did make, and we'll see that later on, that they did make accommodations for accidental death. And if it was accidental, they had what was called cities of refuge all throughout the country. That if you accidentally hurt someone and killed them, you could, and this is one reason you wonder, well, who is the police force at that time? The family of the person who was hurt or killed. They'd come after you. That's why you had cities of refuge. And if you would go to one of those cities of refuge, those families of the person who got killed could not come and get you and kill you until there was a trial that would determine whether or not it was an accident or on purpose. If it was on purpose, then you'd be turned over to them. They didn't have jails, and you can see why they didn't need them. Okay, interesting. If you attacked your father and your mother, you would be stoned to death. If you cursed your father or mother, you'd be stoned to death. I would say they had some well-mannered children back then. If you kidnapped someone, you'd be killed. Now, we heard of eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth, but notice Exodus 21:24 goes in a little more detail. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. One of the things that I saw in the news years ago, a little boy died. He was about 5 or 7, somewhere in that regard, and he was with his mother's boyfriend. I don't know what was wrong with the boyfriend, whether he was on something or just mean, but he took nails and pounded them in the little boy's head and killed him. Now, if you lived back then, that's what would happen to you. If you were a sorceress, you got the death penalty. If you sacrificed something to a god except the Lord God, you'd get the death penalty. If you took advantage of a widow or orphan, you got the death penalty. Because God wanted to protect the widows and orphans. It was a practice later on when the Jews got settled that, and we have examples of this with some of the prophets, and that if a man died and he owed debts, he was able to take that man's children if they could not come up with the money. And so God made strong rules about taking advantage of a widow or orphan. Then some other laws that don't have the death penalty, but some things he said not to do. Don't blaspheme God. Get this one. Or a ruler of the people. How often do we bad talk our leaders, political and otherwise? I think about that sometimes. You remember King David would never, even though Saul was trying to kill him, he wouldn't speak against Saul. He wouldn't lay a hand against Saul, who was the king just before him. Also, if you're a Jew, you did not charge interest if you loaned a fellow Israelite money. There's an example in the Bible of them rebuilding the wall, and it's the book of Nehemiah. And Nehemiah had to deal with Jews who were rich, and their brothers were on the wall trying to build it. The Bible said in one hand they were building the wall, and in the other hand they carried weapons to keep the enemy away. And not only that, other Jewish people were charging them exorbitant interest rates while they were trying to build the wall and defend the nation. And Nehemiah really got on to them about that. All right. He also said, don't hold back any offerings. Sometimes we're shy to encourage Christian people. I'm not talking about visitors that come to church. But sometimes we're shy about encouraging Christian people to give to the Lord. In the Old Testament, they paid tithes. And they were to not hold back their offerings to God. But we know a lot of people in the modern church hold back their offerings. They give just what they feel like giving, or if they don't feel like it, they don't give anything. He said, don't accept bribes. And don't oppress a foreigner. Because he said, you were foreigners in Egypt. You know, I know we live in a time now of illegal aliens who are causing a great deal of confusion in our country and burdensome as far as the debt and everything of the country, and possible and even possibility of our national security being hurt because of terrorists getting in and gangs getting in and cartels getting in and drugs getting in and all of it. And I'm strong against illegal aliens as well, but for those that get in legally, for those, my grandma and grandpa came through, Ellis Island there in New York. They came legally. But my mom said that it was still hard for them as aliens. They were made fun of. Mom was made fun of in school because when she went to school, she still spoke her national language, which was Serbian. And so she had to deal with this. They were looked down upon. They lived in a community in Barberton, Ohio, where all the foreigners lived and the black people lived. And they got along really well among themselves, but other people looked down upon them and wouldn't let them have jobs many times and so on, even though they were, many of them, American citizens. So he said, don't oppress the foreigners. In chapter 23, we'll pick up next week. It talks about Sabbath laws and festivals, and we'll get into more detail about what these festivals were and how you celebrated them, how long you celebrated them. So we'll talk about that next time because it's already 8 o'clock. If you have any questions or comments on what we looked at already from chapters 20, 21, and 22.